All right. So we finally got our app to a kind of semi-working point, working enough. So now we're going to actually finally talk about middleware and what it is doing for us, even though we don't really realize we're using it. So first things first, if we go into our main index file, the one that is directly inside of the SRC folder, where we set up Redux, we npm installed a thing called Redux promise. And then when we create our store down here, as the third argument to create store, we called apply middleware helper function and passed it Redux promise. So we npm installed some middleware. And most commonly, that's what you're going to do. Not in this class. Any middleware we need from here on out, we're going to build ourselves. But it's not as hard and crazy as it might sound. Understanding it's pretty hard and crazy, but the code itself is pretty straightforward. So what is middleware? When we call our action creators, okay, they return an action. They return an object. That object, what I've been telling you guys up until now, is that that object gets passed directly into the reducer. So you call this function, it returns this object. So we call function, returns this object. This is our action. This action then gets passed into our reducer right here. Those are the same object. So whatever that function returns, that object ends up being passed into this function right here. In between those two things happening, you could add middleware. Middleware is a way to take a look at every single action before it hits the reducer. Okay, so every action that is sent to a reducer, before it actually goes into the reducer, it goes into middleware. Okay, so why? What's the point? Why do we want to be able to intercept every single action? Well, most commonly, the reason you'll use middleware, it's not the only reason, but the most common reason is asynchronous actions. Like I showed you guys before, an action creator has to instantly return an object with the type property. It can't wait for asynchronous actions. It has to just instantly return something. Because of the way Redux is set up, that function has to be called and return something. And same for the reducer. The reducer has to be called and return something, so we can't handle asynchronous actions. What the middleware allows us to do is it allows us to check every single action. So in the context of Redux promise, it allows us to check every single action. We check its payload property. If its payload property has a promise, then we hold on to that action, resolve the promise, and then send it to the reducer. If the action does not have a promise on it, then we just send it to the reducer unchanged. This allows us to intercept actions and change them in some way if they need to be changed, and then pass it to the reducer. Another thing you can do with middleware is, let's say you're getting data from a third-party API, and the data is a huge mess. And you don't want to deal with restructuring the object inside your reducer. You could use middleware. So every time that API is called, it could run through some middleware that could then restructure the way the data comes from the server and then send it to the reducer. You can also use it as a debugging tool. You can build some middleware that logs every single action. Okay? You can do anything that you could possibly need to do with an action before it hits the reducer. The whole point of it is to be able to essentially touch every action, see if it needs to be changed, and either change it or not change it, and then pass it on. Okay, so it allows you to intercept actions before they go into the reducer. That is the whole point. Redux promise, as mentioned, is checking for promises. If there's a promise, it resolves the promise and then sends the action forward. That's the functionality we're going to recreate right now. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to break our app. So as it stands right now, our app should be working. We should be able to view an item, do the list, add an item. Everything works, okay? That is because Redux promise is handling all the promises for us. So we can see where this breaks if we make some changes to our code. So if we go back to our main index file, the one where we set everything up, we are going to delete the last two parameters or arguments of create store. So it should just be create store, pass in the root reducer. Then we're going to delete the import statement for Redux promise. So we're no longer using it, so we're going to just delete it. Whenever you stop using something you npm installed, you should npm uninstall it. Okay, we're not using it anymore, so it doesn't need to be installed. If we look at our package.json, we can see we have Redux promise here. Okay, next time someone clones our project or forks it or whatever, when they npm install it, they no longer need this. So we don't need this to be in our list anymore. And you don't just delete it from here. Okay, that's not how you get rid of a package. In your terminal, in the right folder, in our project folder, Redux to-do list folder, we're going to type npm uninstall redux-promise.
You created a new branch off of master, right?
At the very beginning of today, we did this morning. So you could just create one now if you didn't.
Were you just working off the same one we worked on
Earlier today? Yeah. All right, so that's how you uninstall something. It's just npm uninstall, the name of what you want to uninstall. That deletes all the folders inside of your node modules folder that were part of that package. And it also cleans up your package.json. I no longer have Redux promise in my dependencies list. Okay? You should stay on top of that. If you npm install something and end up not using it, or you refactor your code later and it doesn't use it, you should uninstall it. Okay? You don't want to, projects get bloated enough with npm stuff. You don't want to add extra. All right, now if we go to run our project, go to localhost 3000, nothing works. Cannot read property to-dos of undefined. List reducer, line 11. List reducer, line 11, can't read to-do of undefined, so it's saying data is undefined. So if we console.log get list data and reducer, whoa, what did I do? And reducer, I'm just going to say action.payload to see what we have. So when the code runs, we can see action.payload is a promise. Okay, Redux promise before was dealing with this for us. So everything was just working magically because Redux promise was handling it. If we look at our code, it actually makes sense, relatively speaking, what's happening. If we look at our actions index, we're calling axios.get and saving it in the risk constant. Okay, we're calling this, saving it here. We're not awaiting, we're not resolving a promise, we're not doing anything. Axios.get returns a promise. So since we're calling that, saving the result here, this is holding a promise. We're then putting that promise inside of an object. This object is directly going to the reducer. This all happens in less than a millisecond. So it hasn't had time to get data back from the server yet. So this promise gets put on the payload property. And then on the list reducer, action.payload is just promise. Okay, because that's what we set it to. So what Redux promise was doing is it's middleware, so it gets access to check every single action before it goes to the reducer. After the action creator is called, but before it hits the reducer, it's in the middle. It's the name middleware. And it checks, hey, does this action have a payload property? Yes, it does. Cool. Is that payload property a promise? Yes, it is. Okay, I'm gonna handle that promise. And then I'm going to send the data I get back to the reducer. If it doesn't have a payload property, or the payload property is not a promise, then it just doesn't do anything with it. It just sends the action on through. The term middleware is not exclusive to Redux. Middleware is a very common programming thing. If anybody's messed with Node at all, you've probably heard the term middleware. So it's just usually some type of functionality that goes in between two things happening, between the start and the end of something, exactly as its name would imply. So now we got to fix this. We need to write a piece of middleware that checks action.payload, resolves the promise, and then sends the data to the reducer. So we can make custom middleware. So inside of the SRC folder, we'll make a new folder called middleware.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
Just briefly, can you go back to our index where we were at?
All good? You said? Cool. All right, so now we have a middleware folder. We will create a new file inside of it. And we'll just call it promise.js. So the strangest part of middleware is declaring it. It has a very weird function signature, so to speak. Okay, so we're going to write it in ES6 just because it's easier to write that way. But I'll show you what the ES5 translation is so it's a little bit clearer of what's actually going on. So we want to be able to use it in other places, so we're just going to directly export default. And then a function that will receive the Redux store. You know, the Redux store houses all of the Redux state and the Redux functionality. Okay. And that is a function that is then going to return another function that gets whatever the next function is in the chain of stuff. Okay. So whatever the next function to be called after this function is ran is that. So next could be a whole bunch of different stuff. It's not any one thing in particular. It's just whatever's next in the chain, which is a function that returns yet another function. This function gets our action, that object with the type property gets passed to us. And then finally, we could write any code we want here for our middleware. So the good and bad news of this. The bad news is that's crazy to look at. And like, what the hell is going on there? The good news is you always write middleware the same way. It just has that. That's the template for writing middleware. It doesn't change. It's because it's inside of a very tight system. So that's the way you have to define middleware. So all you gotta do is remember that or take a glance at it if you ever want to write your own custom middleware. And what that actually looks like okay, so that's the exact same thing. It's just a little bit cleaner to write in ES6, albeit a little bit harder to understand. I'm not going to even attempt to explain why it's structured like that, but if anybody wants to know, there is a really good explanation of it on the actual Redux website. If you just Google Redux.js and go to the Redux website, go to Advanced Concepts, Middleware, and it explains to why it has to be structured this way. Okay? Is it imperative to your understanding of middleware? I don't think so, but if you just like to know stuff, then it's definitely worth checking out. Might help you understand it. Hard to say. But the short version of it is that's the way it has to be. All right, so our middleware that we're writing, we want to write a piece of middleware that checks the action to see if it has a payload, and then to see if that payload is a promise. How do we check stuff in JavaScript?
Condition.
If statement, conditional. Okay. So we say if. We're actually going to do the opposite of check if it has payload or if the payload is promised. We're going to check that it doesn't have a payload or if the payload is not a promise. We're going to do it a little bit opposite just because it makes more sense that way to me. So we're going to say if not action payload. So if it doesn't have a payload, then do something. So no payload property. Okay. So if there is no action on payload, or if not action dot payload, this is gonna be a trickier one because you guys have been spelled with async await. But how do we know if something's a promise? I know when we console log it says promise, but there's not really a type of check or anything to see if anything's a promise. But there is one method promises always have on them. Then. There you guys. Good job, guys. All promises have a .then method. That's how you resolve it. You say then call this function when you're done. Okay, so all we need to do is check if there's not an action.payload.then it's not a promise. And if it makes it to here, has a promise on the payload property. All right. So if it doesn't have a payload, and payload's not a promise, or even if it does have payload, but payload's not a promise, if any of those things are true, then we don't want to do anything. We don't want to change anything. We just want to pass it on through. Middleware is always built for a specific task. Okay? So it should accomplish one thing. It should solve one problem. And we'll talk more about why it should solve one problem very shortly. But our one problem is that we're trying to solve is the payload property having a promise. If the payload property has a promise, we're going to do something. Otherwise, we don't care. Go on with your life. So we don't want to do anything with it. So all we do is we say return next. We call next and pass it the action. Okay. All that does is calls the next function in the chain, which could be, it could be another middleware, could be the reducer, could be all kinds of different things. Okay, but whatever, just go on to the next thing. We're not changing anything, nothing to see here, move on. Okay, now it's possible, and I'm going to draw you a very nice illustration on the board very shortly. The one and only time you'll see me draw on the board, or at all, ever. And I'll illustrate this in more detail at that point, but it is possible to create an infinite loop with middleware. Okay? So that's why it's very important to be checking for one particular problem and then solving that particular problem. Okay? Because once you solve a problem, once you change an action, you need to send that action back through all the middleware again. So next time it gets here, that problem better be solved. Otherwise, you're going to create an infinite loop. So I'm going to illustrate this out to help illustrate it shortly. Well, let's go on with this. So if the code makes it to where my cursor is, that means we have what we're looking for. We have an action with a payload property that's a promise. So I'm going to do this, write this in the older syntax first, and then we'll switch it to async await. But right now we're going to use .then. So we want to resolve our promise. So we're going to say action .payload .then. Okay, exactly what we were checking for to make sure it didn't have up here. If it doesn't have any of that, it goes here. But if it makes it to here, that means this exists. Okay, if the code makes it to here, this has to be a thing. There then always takes a callback function. And that function is what gets called when the promise is resolved. Okay? Well, we're going to be expecting some kind of response from the promise. And we want to update our action with this new data. So we're going to build a new action. We're going to say const new action equals an object. And we're going to destructure the original action. So all the original properties get added to our new action. So no matter what properties were added onto our action will become part of this new action. Okay? That way, if someone sends other data on their action, it'll still get sent through. Also, so we don't change the type property. We don't want to mess with the type property. Okay? Someone dispatched a very particular action type on purpose, and that's the type that needs to make it to the reducer. So we want to make sure we remember the same type and any other properties they put on their action. However, we want to overwrite the payload property. Okay? We're changing what our if statement was based off of. Okay? We're making a change to the property to the problem we were checking for. We're resolving that problem. And we want to set the payload to the response. And then finally, the store, the Redux store has a function on it called dispatch. Now, I've been kind of throwing, breathe. There we go. I've been throwing the term dispatch at you guys a little bit and sprinkling it in here and there. And dispatch takes action. What dispatch does is it takes an object, an action, and sends it to the reducer. Let me correct that. It sends it to the middleware, which ultimately goes to the reducer. Okay? It resends out an action. Just like a police station dispatches police cars to the scene of a crime. Okay? We're dispatching actions to the reducer. Yeah, they have to go through the middleware to get there, but that's what dispatch does. Dispatch takes an action, sends it through the middleware, and ultimately to the reducer. Okay? Anytime you change the action, you can't just call next on it. Okay? Yeah, this will work in most situations, but you're setting yourself up for failure. Once again, my gorgeous illustration is going to help demonstrate all this. But if you change your action in any way, you need to redispatch it and resend it back through all the middleware again. All right? So that's it. This should work, mostly. There's one more thing we have to fix, but let's test it here first. So now that we built the middleware, we have to plug the middleware into our application, just like we did with the Redux promise. You have to npm install it, and then we have to do a little bit of setup. How's everybody doing here? Everybody good? It's interesting with Redux. Redux especially, it's probably one of the most extreme cases. If you look at any one piece of it, the code's simple. Like, okay, it's a function that's returning an object. Or it's a function with a switch statement. It's all code you could look at and understand. It's just how does it all fit and work together that's the really tough part.
Just keep adding more and more.
This is the last Redux new topic. If that makes you feel any better. Kind of. Sleep. You can sleep tonight now.
But you'll still reuse it in some future projects, right?
Yeah, we're still going to keep using it. This is just the last new concept of Redux we're going to talk about. And we're even going to do this again. This isn't the last time we're going to build our own middleware. Your code shouldn't necessarily be working now. Or it shouldn't be working now. That's what the stress number. Lies. All lies. Do you need help or? Are you good? Okay. No, no, it's not supposed to work.
She's like, well, I fixed it.
So, well, it's working now. Yeah. All right. So we have our middleware. So now we just need to plug it into everything the same way we did with Redux Promise. So we'll go back to our main index file, the one that's in direct child of the SRC folder, where we do our main app setup. And in our import statements, we will import our custom middleware. We'll just call it promise with a lowercase p. And we'll say from this directory, middleware, promise. And then in create store, we'll add back the second argument, which is default state. We'll set to an empty object. And then third is middleware. And we'll say apply middleware, which is a function. So we'll call it, and then we'll pass it any middleware we have. Now your app should work. Okay. Anybody's not work.
I try to add like a new item and it didn't.
That's going to cause issues. Adding an item is going to cause issues. We're going to get to that.
Gotcha.
Do you help again, or do you think you got it? Yeah.
Okay, let's go back. Check the back there.
You have to delete it?
Come back to this one. Let's check. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got use promise from?
Redux promise.
No, Redux. Promise. When you put promise.
Yeah.
Promise. Promise. Okay, go to that promise. Go to promise.
Promise.
Okay.
Wait.
All right. Then you see there's you have something 3 dots.
How's everybody else? You guys having any trouble?
You have 3 dots at the structure and something you
Was it module?
So where, pull up your terminal. Go to your and delete that.
Oh. Do I also delete anything from the JSON?
No.
Yeah.
Almost never be directly.
We're
We
just-
did npm uninstall,
Right.
which removes about.
Oh,
that
so
code.
there's, oh, okay.
Mine was originally
Yeah,
just
'cause
said
I did
action
that.
was not defined.
Oh, that's all it was. Just,
Oh, because it couldn't find Redux promise. Because
And
it's still
it-
trying to import it, so it's trying to find it, but we uninstalled it, so it didn't exist.
So actually sometimes when it still appear on import it can cause a problem even when you use it more.
Well, we actually uninstalled it.
had we not uninstalled it?
It would have been fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so the files didn't that node module didn't exist, so when it tried to find it, it wasn't
It's
there.
not there. Yeah.
Just because you don't use it, it's not going to cause.
Yeah, but you're adding extra code to your project you're not using. So you should never leave unused stuff like that. All right, anybody else? So some of the other ones were sneaking past it.
How much?
I didn't have the yeah, you put the dot in here, so it wasn't checking. So things that have payload equipment, I will make it down here.
Oh.
The gatekeeper wasn't gatekeeping properly. Anybody else? Anybody? All right, so we're gonna do a quick run through of what the code's doing. Okay, and then I'm gonna draw you guys a nice picture, and then we'll be done. All right, so all right, guys. So I'm with me. Chip and Dale. That's the only two names I could think of.
It's on your mind.
Plus, maybe you guys could work there. So when our page loads, it calls the server, gets the data, updates the Redux state, displays the data. What is kind of pseudo happening in our code is our list component mounts. It calls one of our action creators. Okay, get list data. Get list data is this function here. This function calls the server. We store the promise in RESP, and then we dispatch this action. We send this action out. This object right here then goes through any middleware. In this case, we have this promise as this right here, this action. Okay, we put a payload property on it. So it says, if not action.payload. Well, that would end up being false for us because it does have action.payload. And then it says, okay, well, it's an OR statement, so I got to check both sides. If not action.payload.then, which would also evaluate to false. So then it would skip down to this line. It would say action.payload.then. And then once the response came back from the server after some time, so the code's essentially going to kind of wait right here in a sense. And then once the response finally comes back from the server, this function is going to get called. We'll have our response from the server. We'll create a new action with our data, and then we'll dispatch it. When we dispatch it, it comes back up to the top of this function. It comes back into the middleware. Okay, except now it's this new action. So then it hits that if statement again. This time it says action.payload. Well, yeah, it still has action.payload on it. So that will evaluate the false. So then it'll check the OR. And then it says, is there an action.payload.then? Action.payload.then will be undefined. Not undefined is what? What's the opposite of a false value? True. So that'll be true. So now we're going to come inside this if statement, and then we're going to go to the next function and pass it in our new action. And then it goes to the next middleware and then ultimately to the reducer.
So what's the reason then for the action.payload? We can start checking on action.payload.then. It's going to just give us all false or true.
No. Can anybody tell me why we got to check action.payload before we check action.payload.then? Anybody know? Why do we got to check both? Why can't we just put an if statement, if not action.payload.then?
I think it's because you could have a payload that isn't a promise, right? I don't entirely understand.
Not quite. So just in the terms of JavaScript, not even in the terms of React.
Just payload
For the if statement.
payload comes before payload then. You have to have something before then.
There you go. You got it. Okay? Payload would have to be defined to check the then property of payload. If you don't do the check for action.payload first, it will throw an error if payload doesn't exist. If you just say if not action.payload.then, it'll say can't read property then of undefined if the action doesn't have a payload property. So whenever you're checking nested objects like this, you have to check through the chain and build up to the one you're ultimately checking. Otherwise, it will throw an error if it's not defined. We could see that if we do it. Yeah, of course, it's going to make a liar out of me. Lies. I wonder if we're just not dispatching an action that doesn't have it. Yeah, that's why right there. Because all the actions that run through it do have payload. But if we dispatch one somewhere that didn't, it would definitely throw the error. Yes, sir.
Could you go over what this action was?
Yep, that's what I'm gonna draw out on the board.
Okay.
Really quick. You guys don't follow me on this.
On
All over that one. I will throw an error. So when you dispatch an action, so it has payload, so it's not going to throw an error because it made it through the check. But here, where there is no payload property on the action, cannot read property then of undefined.
Okay.
So it's throwing an error here because payload doesn't exist, so it can't try and read the property then of something that's not defined. That's why you got to check down the whole chain first. And now it doesn't break it. All right. So let me clean that up. And let me draw you guys a lovely picture really quick. Yay. How funny. The last thing that was on here was from my drawing.
You get done?
Well, I've never noticed it before.
But I'll give you guys enough. We'll start over. Okay, this is on here pretty good.
You can just investigate.
That's what that is. We'll just use it.
It's gonna have layers upon layers.
All right. So when you have, guys, come on. When you have your action creator, it returns an object. That object is called what we call dispatched. Okay, that object is sent through the middleware. Okay, it runs through each piece of middleware. And then ultimately, after it runs through all the middlewares, it goes into the reducer and then gets turned into state. In the middleware, we had next. We have that next function. That next function just calls the next thing. So you come to some middleware, okay, and there next is called and pass the action. That is passed to the next piece, and then the next piece, and then ultimately to the reducer. So next just goes in line to the next thing, exactly like it sounds. It goes to the next piece in the puzzle. Now what dispatch does is from this middleware, if, say in Redux promise, we call store.dispatch and we pass it the action, then as is already illustrated here, dispatch sends it back up to the top and then it runs through all the middleware again. You want to design your middleware in such a way that the order of it doesn't matter. Okay? A lot of times you'll be using more than one middleware. And you want your middleware to play nicely with all other middlewares. Yes.
Sorry, what causes dispatch to happen?
You call it.
Oh.
Yeah, where we store.dispatch and pass it the new action we created. You look at the promise file. So you want your middleware to play nicely with other middlewares. So let's say instead of having some middleware here, this refactors the data from the server. Okay? Well, let's say we make a server call. The server call has the promise on the payload property. So when it comes here, it's like, hey, there's no server data. Just pass on through. And then Redux promise says, okay, resolve the promise. I have the server data. And if I just send it to the next thing, it's never going to go to our refactor middleware. Okay, so you'd have to be very careful with the order in which you set up your middleware. So it gets called in the order that you pass it into that apply middleware function. When you apply middleware, you can pass it as many arguments as you want, each argument being a new piece of middleware. It gets executed in the order that you pass it in. So yeah, you could do that, but you don't ever want to count on or assume people are going to do stuff the right way. So when you set it up properly, it goes, okay, nothing to refactor. I don't have any data. I'm going to go to Redux promise. Redux promise says, hey, I have a promise. I'm going to resolve that promise. Now I have the data from the server. I'm going to send it back through all the middleware in case another piece of middleware needed to do something with that data. And in this case, it did. It goes, okay, here, now I refactored the data. So I'm going to send it back up to the top again, make sure that nobody above me needed it. And then once it goes through each thing, it's like, okay, now I'm done, and go to the reducer. Which brings me to the next point of it's easy to create an infinite loop, which is why at the top, the very first thing you need to do when you're creating middleware is define the problem you're trying to solve well and how to check for that problem. And then however you check for that problem, make sure you're fixing that problem at the end of the middleware. Otherwise, next time it comes back through, it's going to just end up on an infinite loop if you're never fixing the problem you're checking for. Okay? And the one we built, we're checking for a promise on the payload property. Well, we redefine the payload property with data that's no longer promised. We are fixing the condition we were checking for. Okay? So middleware always needs to fix whatever condition you're looking at. So action creator returns an action. Action goes to the middleware. If any of these middlewares call dispatch, dispatch sends it back up to the top, and it goes through it again until it's gone through and done everything it needs to do, and then it ultimately ends up in the reducer, resetting the state.
Is it typical that it just goes through twice then, if it's successful?
It depends. Depends on how many middlewares you're doing and what they're all doing.
Okay.
So then will each middleware dispatch once? Because it'll dispatch.
It should only dispatch one time.
And then it should get cleared the next time it gets
yes.
into the
Yeah, it should.
moved.
Yeah. Yeah, if we look at our code, I know we're running out of time, but we're ran out of time already. Sounds like Dan's still talking over there, so I think we're good.
So you're gonna listen to them? You're gonna listen to them?
Gonna listen to Dan?
Yeah.
No. One more. Oh, I forgot to turn the camera on. Oh, well. Sorry, guys.
You wanna buy some?
Is the drawing gonna forever be etched into?
It looks like it. The last one is still there. Apparently, I want to use the board. All right, guys. So right here where we call apply middleware, we're passing a promise. You could pass in multiple pieces of middleware. And the order you pass them in is the order that they will get executed in. Now, once again, if the middleware was well designed, it should not matter. The order should not matter. Okay? One last thing that we need to fix, though, and then we'll be done. If we run our app, it mostly looks like it's working. We can see each item. We can see our list. However, if we go to add item,
What colors?
what do you mean?
Was it purple and green?
At the display.
This one wasn't. Oh, that's the it's the projector.
Yeah, when you tab to all of it.
Yeah, on mine. I was like, what are you guys talking about? Mine's the same color it's always been. You guys have lost your minds.
Yeah, the screen. Oh.
There you go.
There we go.
It's back. So if I say middleware test, so you notice my list, it doesn't list middleware test. Okay? So it's navigating faster than it's calling the server. If I refresh the page, it is there, so it is working. It's just that the navigation is happening faster than the call to the server, which would indicate, if I go to my add item component, in handle add item, it's calling this, and it's not awaiting before it goes to here. And if it's not awaiting, that means as new item is not returning a promise. So if we broke something to where calling this is no longer returning a promise like it was before. And it's actually a really simple solution in code. Wrapping your brain around why it works is a whole different story. But to fix this issue, and you should always do this with your middleware, like how we returned here, you always should be returning something from your middleware. Down here, we never returned anything. And we want to set ours up so whenever there is a promise, that when we call our action creators, that they return a promise. And oddly enough, that's controlled by partly by what your middleware returns. Wrap your brain around that one. So anyway, so what we need to do is we need our middleware to return a promise. So we say return, and we have a promise at action.payload. Because it's a promise because we checked for it. And now that our middleware is returning a promise, when we call our action creator, it will actually return this. It's all just a function, man. It's all just a function. So now if we add item, how it works. Because now our action creator is returning a promise, so it will listen to the await. And we're good to go. Is Dan still teaching? Or is he talking to people? Last really quick thing, and I promise we're done. I'll just do a quick refactor of async await for you guys, if anybody cares. All right, so I'm going to change this a little bit. If you want to comment yours out or something, I'll do this so it's easier for you guys to follow. Okay, so first thing we do is with async await is we have to tell JavaScript that this function is going to have some kind of asynchronous actions. Now we have a chain of functions, but the only one we care about is this last function. Okay, so we need to tell this last function to be asynchronous.
You leave one.
Yep. Still inside the function. All right. And then we say const response equals await action dot payload. And then we rebuild our object in the same way. And then we say store.dispatch the new action. And then just for good measure, return the response. Here you don't have to return anything because as soon as we put that async keyword, this function will automatically return a promise now. Async will make any and every function return a promise. So same exact steps are happening, same thing's happening, just slightly different syntax. Wait for the promise to resolve, save it into response, create our new action, dispatch the new action, return the response.
So you don't have to return the action payload either?
Not here because async will automatically return a promise. I said same exact code for the most part, just written slightly differently. End result being the same though. All right. So that's middleware. We are going to build a different middleware on Wednesday called Thunk. Thunk is a pretty popular middleware that is used. It's even simpler to write and even more popular than Redux Promise is. But it's very simple, very clever concept of whoever thought of it. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this, and you guys might be even more relieved to hear it now, you're almost never going to write your own middleware. Okay? Few and far between, if ever. But the more you understand about any system you're using, the better off you'll be and the more efficient you'll be in using it. And I highly recommend whenever you're working on a project on your own where time is not of a huge time crunch, you should code stuff out yourself and not npm install things, with the exception of major packages like React itself or Redux itself or Express. With exceptions of major packages, npm installing packages to do little simple things, you should really avoid in the beginning.
Most likely we're not sure how big schema, how complicated.
If it's outside of a major framework, you probably shouldn't install it. Practice, man. You don't want to be a code monkey.
Yeah, right.
So in the beginning, you were actually a monkey, so you're not that sure which one is hard, what's easy, which one
You should try. Try all of it. All right. Everybody good? So we should be doing presentations any minute now. You should go ahead and add commit and push to your branch. I don't think we're going to revisit this project. And that's about it for this one. On Wednesday, we'll be starting a new project. We'll be talking about user authentication on the front end. Yeah.